Dorothy Vane did not look back. That was the part Elsie Carter would never forget. Not the cold, not the hunger, not even the sound of the wagon wheels grinding away through the frozen mud. It was the fact that the woman never once turned around. She climbed up onto that wagon bench, snapped the reins across the horse's back, and drove away like she was leaving behind a broken piece of furniture. Like Elsie was something she had simply finished using. Elsie was 9 years old, standing in the middle of nowhere with a torn blanket around her shoulders, a small canvas sack of supplies at her feet, and a wooden horse carved by her father's hands clutched so hard against her chest that the edges left marks on her palm. The wind moved across the plains like something alive and angry. She did not cry. She had already learned that crying didn't change anything. If you've ever asked yourself what you would do if the one person left in your life decided you weren't worth keeping, this is that story. And if you want to find out whether a child like Elsie ever finds her way home, make sure you subscribe to this channel and follow every part of this story to the end, because you will not want to miss what happens next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The morning it happened had started like most mornings on the frontiers, cold, gray, and indifferent. Elsie had been awake before the sun, the way she always was since her father got sick. She'd learned early that sleeping too late meant missing the window when Dorothy was still groggy enough to be almost civil. In those first quiet minutes before Dorothy fully woke up, there was something close to peace in the camp. Just the sound of the fire catching, the horses shifting their weight in their traces, and the distant call of something moving through the tree line. Her father, Thomas Carter, had died 11 days ago. 11 days. Elsie had been counting. He'd gone down with fever somewhere in the stretch of open territory between the last settlement they'd passed and the mountains ahead. He'd fought it for almost 3 weeks before his body simply gave out, and when he drew his last breath, Elsie had been holding his hand. Dorothy had been outside, arguing with the wagon master about whether the group should stop or keep moving. Thomas had squeezed Elsie's fingers right before the end. He hadn't been able to say anything by then. The fever had taken his voice days before, but he'd looked at her with that particular look she'd seen on his face her whole life. The one that meant, "I know this is hard. I know. Keep going anyway." She'd carried that look with her every day since. The wagon train had kept moving, and Dorothy had allowed it, because Dorothy was nothing if not practical. Grief was a luxury for people with time and safety, and out here on the trail, neither of those things came easy. Elsie had understood that much. What she hadn't understood, not right away, was what her father's death meant for her own place in the world. Thomas had married Dorothy Vane 2 years earlier, after Elsie's mother passed. It hadn't been a love match. Anyone who'd watched them together could see that. Dorothy was a widow herself, sharp and capable, and used to arranging things to her own benefit. Thomas had needed someone to help run the household and look after Elsie while he worked. Dorothy had needed a man with enough land and savings to make the westward journey worth attempting. They'd made their arrangement, exchanged vows in front of a preacher in a town neither of them had been born in, and that had been that. Elsie had never called her mother. Dorothy had never asked her to. For 2 years, they'd existed in the same spaces without quite occupying the same world. Dorothy cooked the meals and managed the supplies and told Elsie what to do with the flat, efficient voice of someone managing an inventory. Elsie had done what she was told and stayed out of the way and tried not to need anything that wasn't strictly necessary. It had worked, more or less, while Thomas was alive. On the 12th day after her father's death, Dorothy called Elsie to the back of the wagon while the rest of the camp was breaking down tents. Elsie had climbed up thinking she was going to be handed something to carry. A sack of flour, maybe, or one of the water jugs. Dorothy was always finding things for her to carry. Instead, Dorothy handed her the canvas sack. "What's this?" Elsie had asked, because she didn't understand yet. "Everything I can spare," Dorothy said. She didn't look at Elsie when she said it. She was folding a blanket with practiced efficiency, her eyes on her own hands. "There's dried meat, a tin of crackers, matches, and a blanket. It's not much, but it's more than you earned." The words took a moment to land. Elsie stared at the sack. Then she looked up at Dorothy's face. "I don't understand." "Yes, you do. You're leaving me." Dorothy finally looked at her then. And what Elsie saw on that face wasn't cruelty exactly. It was worse than that. It was nothing. Just a flat, businesslike absence of feeling, the expression of a woman who had already worked out the arithmetic and arrived at her answer. "Your father is gone," Dorothy said. "You're not my blood. I have myself to worry about and a journey still ahead. I can't afford to carry extra weight." "I'm 9, Elsie said. Her voice came out strange, smaller than she intended. "I know how old you are. There's nobody out here. There's nothing for miles." "The wagon master says there's a settlement 2 days east," Dorothy said. She went back to folding the blanket. "You're a sturdy girl. You'll manage." Elsie thought about several things at once in the next few seconds. She thought about her father's hands, the way they'd smelled like sawdust and leather. She thought about the wooden horse he'd carved for her on a long winter evening, how he'd held it out to her and said it was going to bring her luck. She thought about the settlement that was apparently 2 days east, which was 2 days in the wrong direction from the wagon train, across terrain she didn't know, in weather that had been dropping below freezing every night for a week. "Please," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out on its own, small and bare and humiliating. Dorothy set down the blanket. She picked up the canvas sack and held it out to Elsie. "Take it," she said, "and take that toy your father made you. I don't have room for it either." That was when Elsie understood that begging wasn't going to work. Something in her chest went very quiet. Not calm exactly, but quiet the way a room goes quiet when the last person leaves it. She took the sack. She took the wooden horse. She climbed down from the wagon without another word. She stood in the frozen mud and watched the camp dismantle itself around her, watched the men hitch their horses and the women pack their bundles and the children chase each other between the wagons. Nobody looked at her directly. A few of them glanced sideways. She could feel those glances on her skin like something cold. One woman, a heavy-set German lady named Mrs. Brenner, who had sometimes given Elsie bread rolls when Dorothy wasn't watching, walked past and then stopped. She looked at Elsie. She looked at the sack in Elsie's hands. Her face did something complicated. "I'm sorry," Mrs. Brenner said quietly, in her accented English. I have my own children, 5 of them, and my husband. He would not." "It's all right," Elsie said. It wasn't all right, but she said it anyway because she could see that Mrs. Brenner was genuinely sorry, and she didn't want to make the woman feel worse. Her father had taught her that. People can be sorry and still not be able to fix things. Those are 2 different problems. Mrs. Brenner pressed something into her free hand, 2 hard biscuits wrapped in a cloth, and then moved away quickly, like she was afraid to linger. Elsie put the biscuits in the sack. Then the wagon train started moving, and she watched it go. Dorothy never turned around. The cold set in properly by mid-afternoon. Elsie had been walking east, or what she thought was east, using the sun as her guide the way her father had shown her. She kept her pace steady and her head down against the wind and tried not to think about how much ground 2 days walking actually covered, and whether she was covering it in the right direction and what exactly she was going to find when she got there. The wooden horse was tucked inside her coat, against her ribs. She could feel it with each breath. The smooth, worn wood, the small, carved mane. Her father had made it from a piece of oak he'd found along the Missouri River, had spent 3 evenings carving it while she sat across the fire and watched his hands work. He'd been a careful carver, slow, precise, more interested in getting it right than getting it done. She missed him so much it felt like a physical thing, like a stone she was carrying somewhere behind her sternum. The terrain was brutal in the way that Montana terrain often is in deep winter. Not dramatic, not mountainous, just relentlessly flat and open and punishing. The wind had nowhere to break against, so it didn't bother trying. It moved across the landscape like it owned it, and maybe it did. By the time the sun started dropping, Elsie had been walking for 6 hours. She found a shallow depression in the ground near a stand of bare cottonwood trees and made her camp there, using the technique her father had taught her. Pile whatever insulating material you can find underneath you, because you lose more heat through the ground than through the air. She used dead grass and bark, and her blanket layered carefully. She managed to get a small fire started on the 3rd try with the matches from the sack, sheltered in the crook of the depression where the wind couldn't hit it directly. She ate a small piece of dried meat and half a biscuit. Then she sat with her back against the side of the depression and held the wooden horse in both hands and watched the fire and tried to make herself believe she was going to be fine. She was good at making herself believe things when she had to. Her father had called it stubbornness. Mrs. Brenner had called it, in her careful way, fortitude. Dorothy had called it being difficult. Elsie called it surviving. She did not sleep much that first night. The cold pressed in from every side, even with the fire, and every time she started to drift, something would move in the darkness beyond the cottonwoods. An animal, the wind shifting, a branch settling under the weight of ice, and she'd snap awake with her heart hammering. She kept the fire going as long as she could and then let it die when the last of the nearby wood was gone. In the darkest part of the night, she thought about her father. She thought about the night he'd gotten the worst of the fever, when she'd sat beside him and held a damp cloth to his forehead and talked to him even though she didn't know if he could hear her. She'd told him about a book she'd read once, about a sailor who got lost at sea and found an island and learned to make do. She'd told him she understood now why her mother used to say that the hardest thing in the world wasn't the bad moments. It was the ones in between, when you didn't know what was coming and had to just keep going anyway. "You're right about that," her father had said. Or she thought he had. His voice had been so weak by then that she wasn't entirely sure she hadn't imagined it. She thought about that now, in the dark and the cold. Keep going anyway. The second day was harder than the first. Her feet, which had been merely cold the previous afternoon, were now threatening to become something worse. She had 2 pairs of socks and had learned somewhere that keeping them dry mattered more than keeping them thick. So she'd swapped to the second pair that morning and hung the first pair inside her coat to dry against her body. The maneuver was miserable and probably looked ridiculous, and she didn't care even slightly. The landscape around her was the same, open, flat, endless, indifferent. Around midday, she found a frozen creek and followed it because her father had told her that water sources usually led somewhere useful. Settlements, travelers, at the very minimum, trees, which meant fuel. The creek wound in the general direction she thought was east, so she kept it at her left shoulder and walked. She ate the rest of the dried meat. She kept the second biscuit. By mid-afternoon of the second day, she had eaten the second biscuit and was beginning to have a serious conversation with herself about her situation. She was not panicking. She had decided somewhere around the end of the first night that panicking wasn't going to be available to her as an option. Panicking took energy, and energy was a resource she was running short on. What she was doing instead was thinking. She thought about the settlement Dorothy had mentioned, 2 days east. She was somewhere in the second day now, so it should be. The wind shifted, and on it, very faintly, she smelled smoke. Not campfire smoke, chimney smoke, the denser, woodier smell of a building with a hearth that had been burning all day. She'd grown up in a house. She knew that smell as well as she knew her own hands. She stopped walking. She stood in the frozen landscape and breathed carefully through her nose and tried to figure out what direction the smell was coming from. Northeast. Maybe. She adjusted her path. The wooden horse pressed against her ribs with every step. She almost missed the Ridge Rider entirely. She was so focused on the smell of smoke and the effort of keeping her feet moving that she didn't look up until she heard the horse, a single set of hooves, moving at a canter across the ridge line, maybe 200 yards to her north. She stopped and looked up and saw the silhouette. A big man on a big horse, moving parallel to her path, his attention clearly fixed somewhere ahead of him. She had a fraction of a second to make a decision. She could stay quiet, let him pass, keep following the smoke. Or she could yell. The thing about asking a stranger for help was that you didn't know, going in, what kind of stranger they were. Her father had taught her that too. Out here, people are mostly decent. Mostly. But you use your judgment, Elsie. You look at a person before you open your mouth to them. She looked at the man on the ridge. He was riding a good horse, not showy but well cared for, moving easily under him despite the cold. His coat was heavy wool, practical, not the kind of thing someone wore to make an impression. He wasn't moving with the darting urgency of someone running from something. He moved like a man who knew exactly where he was and where he was going, which out here, in this weather, meant he probably lived within a reasonable distance. She made her decision. "Hey!" she shouted. The wind took her voice and threw it sideways. She tried again, louder. "Hey! Hey, mister!" The man on the ridge checked his horse, pulled it to a stop. She could see him scanning, looking for the source of the sound, which would be hard to pin down with the wind moving the way it was. She waved both arms. He saw her. There was a pause, just a second or two, but she felt it. The pause of a person deciding something. She understood that pause. She was living it. Then he turned his horse and started toward her, picking his way down from the ridge at a careful angle, not rushing, which she decided was a good sign. Rushing would have meant alarm or aggression. Careful meant thinking. As he got closer, she could see more of him. Somewhere in his 40s, she guessed, though the frontier aged people in ways that made guessing difficult. He had a broad, weathered face and the kind of jaw that looked like it didn't smile often. He rode with easy, practiced confidence. When he pulled his horse up in front of her and looked down, she saw his eyes. Dark brown, direct, and currently working very hard to figure out what he was looking at. "You alone?" he said. "Yes, sir." "How long?" "2 days." Something moved behind his eyes. Not pity exactly, more like a rapid, quiet calculation. "You're not from the settlement?" "No, sir. There was a wagon train. She stopped. She was going to say my stepmother left me, but something made her reconsider the phrasing, some instinct about how that might sound and what this man might do with information about a woman traveling alone who'd abandoned a child. She didn't know yet if this was a man who would try to find Dorothy and return Elsie to her, which was not something she wanted. "I got separated." He looked at her for a long moment. She held very still and looked back. "You're freezing," he said finally. "Yes, sir." "How's your feet?" She hadn't expected that question. She blinked. "I've kept them dry, swapped to dry socks this morning." He nodded once, slowly, like she'd said something he approved of. Then he shifted in his saddle and looked out across the landscape in the direction she'd been walking. "My ranch is about 4 miles northeast," he said. "You can walk it probably, or you can ride behind me, which is faster and warmer." He didn't offer it like it was a gift. He offered it like it was a practical option that she was free to accept or decline. She appreciated that. Being offered things like gifts made her feel like she owed something. Being offered things like options made her feel like she still had some control over her situation. "Ride," she said. He reached down and took her hand and pulled her up behind him with surprising ease, and she wrapped her arms around his middle and held on, and the horse moved beneath them. And for the first time in 2 days, Elsie allowed herself to believe, not know, just believe, that she might actually survive this. The wooden horse pressed between her ribs and her forearms, warm from her body heat, still there. She kept her eyes open the whole ride. The ranch appeared out of the gray afternoon like something her imagination had conjured. A cluster of solid, practical buildings arranged against the wind, smoke rising from 2 separate chimneys, horses moving in a paddock behind a weathered fence. It wasn't beautiful exactly, but it was real, and it was standing, and those 2 things were enough. The man's name, she learned when they reached the yard, was Caleb Mercer. She learned it because a woman came out of the main house when she heard hooves, a compact, dark-haired woman in her 30s who moved with the kind of efficiency that Elsie associated with people who ran households, who managed things, who knew exactly what needed doing at any given moment. She looked at Caleb, then at the child riding behind him, and her face did something quick and complicated. "Who is this?" she said. "Found her walking the flats," Caleb said. He swung down from the horse and reached up to help Elsie dismount. 2 days out." The woman looked at Elsie with a careful, measuring look that was entirely different from Dorothy's measuring look. Dorothy measured to find deficiency. This woman seemed to be measuring to find what was needed. "Come inside," she said. "Right now." "Isabella," Caleb said, in a tone that suggested this was her name, and also that he was not going to argue with whatever she was about to do. "Don't you Isabella me? She's half frozen," the woman said, already moving toward Elsie. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's get you inside." Elsie followed her. At the door of the house, she stopped and looked back at Caleb Mercer, who was standing in the yard holding his horse's reins and watching her with that same calculating, careful look he'd had on the ridge. The look of a man who was still deciding something. She didn't know yet what he was deciding. She went inside. The warmth of the house hit her like a physical thing. The heat from the hearth, the smell of something cooking, the solid reality of a roof above her and walls around her. For a moment, she just stood there in the doorway and breathed. Isabella was already pulling a chair close to the fire, talking in a low, steady stream about warming up slowly, about getting the boots off, about not putting cold fingers directly near the flame. Elsie sat down and started unlacing her boots with fingers that weren't cooperating properly, and Isabella crouched in front of her and helped without being asked. When her boots came off, Elsie looked at her feet. The socks were damp. Not soaked, but damp. She'd kept them drier than she'd expected. "You did good," Isabella said, looking at the socks. "Most grown men lose toes doing what you just did." "My father taught me," Elsie said. Isabella glanced up at her face. Something passed between them, a question, and Elsie's answer to the question, communicated without a word. "He's gone?" Isabella said. 11 days ago, Elsie said. Then, after a moment, 13 now. Isabella was quiet for a moment. Then she put her hand briefly over Elsie's cold fingers and didn't say anything, which was exactly the right response. Elsie pulled the wooden horse out of her coat and set it on her knee. Isabella looked at it. "He made that? Last winter. Said it would bring me luck." "It brought you here," Isabella said. "That's something." From outside they could hear Caleb moving around the yard. The sounds of a horse being put up, a gate being latched, the particular rhythm of a man going through familiar work, the sounds of someone who was home. Elsie looked at the fire. She was warm. She was inside. She was alive. She did not know yet what came next. She did not know what Caleb Mercer was going to do with a 9-year-old girl who'd turned up out of the wilderness with a canvas sack and a wooden horse and a story that didn't quite add up. She didn't know if this was going to be a place she could stay or just a stop on the way to somewhere else. She had learned, in the last 2 weeks, not to assume that a kindness meant permanence. But she was warm, and for tonight, that was enough. Caleb came inside an hour later, just as Isabella was spooning something into a bowl and setting it in front of Elsie. A thick stew that smelled like onions and venison and made her stomach clench with need. She'd been trying to eat it slowly, the way her father had told her to do when you'd been without food. Your body will try to rush you, and you have to be smarter than your body. But it was difficult. Caleb hung his coat on the peg by the door and stood there for a moment, looking at the room, at Isabella moving around the kitchen, at Elsie sitting at the table with her bowl. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "You want to tell me what actually happened?" he said. His voice was quiet and direct. Not unkind, but not soft either. The voice of a man who didn't see the point in pretending. Elsie set down her spoon. She thought about lying. It would have been easy enough. She'd been separated from the wagon train. She'd gotten turned around. The story she'd given him on the ridge was not entirely untrue, after all. She had been separated, just not by accident. But there was something in his face, that steadiness, that directness, that made lying feel like the wrong choice. Not because she was afraid of getting caught, but because she had a feeling, in the particular way that children sometimes have feelings about people, that this was a man who would respond better to the truth than to a careful construction of it. She picked up the wooden horse. "She left me," Elsie said. "My stepmother. She put a bag of supplies in my hands and told me to walk east and drove the wagon away." Caleb's face didn't move. His eyes did. Something shifted behind them, something dark and controlled. He folded his hands on the table and looked at them for a moment. "She say why?" "Said she couldn't afford extra weight, that I wasn't her blood." "How long had your father been gone?" 11 days when she did it. He was quiet for a long time. Isabella at the stove had gone very still. "What's your name?" Caleb said finally. "Elsie. Elsie Carter." "How old are you, Elsie Carter?" 9. He nodded. He picked up the wooden horse from where she'd set it on the table and turned it over in his large hands, looking at the carving, the care in it, the hours it represented. "Your father do good work," he said. "He was patient," Elsie said. "He said you couldn't carve something right if you were in a hurry." Caleb set the horse back down, precisely where it had been. "All right," he said. That was all. Just all right. She didn't know what it meant, whether it meant she could stay, or that he'd understood her, or that he'd decided something, but it felt like something. It felt like the kind of words that people said when they were done deciding and had arrived at a conclusion. She picked up her spoon and went back to eating. Outside, the wind moved across the Montana plains, cold and relentless, and completely indifferent to the small drama happening inside one solid, smoke-breathing ranch house. The drama of a man and a child sitting across a table from each other, both of them a little broken, both of them trying to figure out what came next, neither of them quite ready yet to say out loud what they were starting to suspect, that maybe they had each found something they hadn't known they were looking for. The fire crackled. Elsie ate her stew. The wooden horse sat on the table between them, patient as wood, carrying whatever luck it still had left. Elsie slept for 14 hours. Isabella checked on her twice in the night, once around midnight, when the fire in the small room off the kitchen had burned low and needed stoking, and once just before dawn, when something had made her wake suddenly with the particular unease of a person responsible for something fragile. Both times, the girl was deeply, completely unconscious, curled on her side with the wooden horse held against her chest and her breathing slow and even. Both times, Isabella stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary before going back to bed. In the morning, when Elsie finally surfaced, Isabella was already in the kitchen and Caleb was already gone, out to the ranch before first light, the way he always was, the way he'd been since long before Isabella had come to work here. She heard the girl moving around in the small room, heard the particular quiet of someone waking up in an unfamiliar place and taking stock of it. And then the door opened and Elsie appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked better than she had the night before, color in her face, and her eyes were clearer. But she was holding the wooden horse, and she was standing in the doorway rather than walking through it, which Isabella recognized as the posture of a child who had learned that entering a room uninvited could have consequences. "Morning," Isabella said. "Sit down. There's oatmeal." Elsie sat down. She ate the oatmeal carefully, in small spoonfuls, the way Isabella had noticed the night before. Controlled, measured, not the way a hungry child usually ate, but the way a child ate when they'd learned that food wasn't guaranteed and wasting it on speed was a mistake. "You don't have to eat like that here," Isabella said, not unkindly. Elsie looked up. "There's more in the pot," Isabella said, "and there'll be food tonight. You don't have to ration it." Elsie looked at her bowl. Then she took a slightly larger spoonful. It was a small thing, but Isabella filed it away. "Where does Mr. Mercer go in the morning?" Elsie asked. "Everywhere," Isabella said. "This ranch doesn't run itself. He's usually out from first light to past dark this time of year, trying to get ahead of the weather before it gets worse." "How big is the ranch?" "Big enough that I've lived here 3 years and haven't seen all of it." Elsie thought about that. "He lives here alone? Except for you?" "He has ranch hands, 4 of them right now, maybe 6 in summer. They bunk in the far building." Isabella poured herself a second cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. "And I work here. I'm his housekeeper. I have a room, but it's not the same as family." She wasn't sure why she'd said that last part, maybe because the girl was going to figure it out anyway, and it was better to say it plainly than let her draw her own conclusions. Elsie nodded like she understood the distinction perfectly, which she probably did. "Did he used to have family?" Elsie asked. Isabella was quiet for a moment. "That's his story to tell," she said. "Not mine." Elsie accepted that without pushing, which told Isabella something. A child who'd learned not to push for information she wasn't offered. A child who'd been taught, one way or another, that curiosity had costs. What? Caleb came back at midday, which was unusual. He rarely came in before the evening meal. Isabella was in the middle of showing Elsie how to roll biscuit dough, a task that had revealed that Elsie's hands were steadier than her size suggested, and that she paid attention to instruction in a particular focused way that reminded Isabella of someone taking careful notes. He stood in the doorway and looked at the scene in his kitchen. The child at the table, flour on her hands, watching Isabella's demonstration with complete attention. And something crossed his face that Isabella caught and did not comment on. "Elsie," he said. She looked up immediately, alert but not afraid. "Good. When you're done, come find me in the barn." He left before she could answer. Isabella looked at Elsie. Elsie looked at the dough. "Finish the row," Isabella said. "Then wash your hands." The barn was warm in the particular way that large animal spaces are warm in winter. Not comfortable, not the warmth of a hearth, but the dense, close heat of bodies and breath and packed straw. Elsie pushed the door open and stood in it for a moment, letting her eyes adjust. Caleb was in the third stall, working on a horse's foreleg with the focused attention of a man who took such things seriously. He didn't look up when she came in, but he knew she was there. "Close the door," he said. She did. "Come here." She walked down the barn aisle, past the first two stalls, and stopped at the gate of the third. The horse inside was a gray mare, big and solid, who turned her head to look at Elsie with calm, dark eyes. "You said your father taught you things," Caleb said. "About cold, about keeping dry. What else did he teach you?" Elsie thought about it seriously, the way he seemed to prefer. "How to read a map, a little. How to start a fire. How to gut a fish, though I'm not fast at it. How to tell when weather's turning before it turns." She paused. "How to read people." He glanced at her then, just briefly. "Read them how?" He said most people show you who they are in the first few minutes if you pay attention. That people are mostly decent but not always careful, and those are different problems. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He went back to the horse's leg, running his hand down the tendon with practiced attention. "You scared of horses?" he said. "No." "You sure? That's a big animal." "I know what size it is," Elsie said. "I'm not scared of it." He looked at her again. Then he unlatched the stall gate and swung it open. "Come in then," he said. She went in. The gray mare shifted her weight, turning to look at this new small person in her space. Elsie stood still and let the horse look, which was the right thing to do. The horse dropped her nose and sniffed at Elsie's hair, a long exploratory sniff that moved from her temple to her ear, warm breath moving in a cloud in the cold air. Elsie didn't move. "Good," Caleb said. He was watching her, she realized, not the horse. "What's her name?" Elsie said. "I call her Pearl. She came in with a stone bruise on that foot 2 weeks ago. Getting better, but she's been stall-rested and she doesn't love it." As if to confirm this opinion, Pearl turned away from Elsie and went back to the corner of her stall, swishing her tail with the particular irritation of an animal that was bored and knew it. "She needs something to do," Elsie said. Caleb looked at her. "She can't work the foot yet." "Not work, just something to think about." Elsie looked around the stall. "My father's neighbor had a horse who got stall-rested after a bad fall. She started chewing the wood." She pointed at the top rail of the stall, which had, in fact, been chewed. "She needs something to occupy her. A ball, maybe, or a hanging rope. Something she can push around." Caleb followed her pointing finger to the chewed rail. He looked at it for a moment. "Huh," he said. It wasn't enthusiasm, but it wasn't dismissal either. They stood in the stall together for another few minutes, Caleb finishing his work on Pearl's foreleg, and Elsie watching in the specific quiet of someone who was comfortable with silence and with animals and with being in a space where she wasn't required to fill it with chatter. When he stood up and collected his tools, he looked at her directly. "I need to figure out what to do with you," he said. "Not today, but soon. I want you to know that I know that." "Okay," Elsie said. "You have any family? Anyone your father mentioned? Relatives somewhere?" "An uncle in Oregon. I don't know where exactly. My father didn't talk to him much." Caleb nodded. "All right. For now, you stay. You help Isabella. You stay out of the way of the ranch hands, and you don't go past the south fence line without telling someone." It was not a warm invitation. There was no softness in it, no performance of welcome. It was a set of conditions stated plainly by a man who operated in plain statements. "Thank you," Elsie said. He picked up his toolkit and walked past her toward the barn door. At the door, he stopped, didn't turn around. "That rope idea," he said. "For Pearl. I'll find one." Then he was gone. Elsie stood in the stall with the gray mare and listened to his footsteps cross the frozen yard, and felt something shift slightly in her chest. Not relief, not happiness, but something more tentative than those. The cautious recognition of a possibility. She reached up and rested her hand on Pearl's neck. Pearl, who had been ignoring her entirely, turned her head and looked at her. "Me too," Elsie said. The first 2 weeks were not easy, and Elsie would not have described them as anything other than what they were. The ranch was a working place, not a comfortable one. The cold was serious and constant. Caleb's 4 ranch hands, 2 brothers named Roy and Dennis Falk, an older man everyone called Hutch, and a younger one named Miguel who was maybe 20 and seemed perpetually surprised by everything, were polite to her in the way that people are polite to something that has appeared unexpectedly in their environment and they're not sure what to make of. They tipped their hats when she passed. They did not know what to say to her, so mostly they said nothing. Hutch was the exception. Hutch was somewhere in his 60s, had a white beard, and the deeply lined face of a man who'd spent decades outdoors, and seemed entirely unbothered by Elsie's presence in a way the others weren't. On her 3rd day, he found her sitting on the fence of the paddock, watching the horses, and came and leaned on the fence beside her without asking, and they'd watched together in silence for a while. "You know horses?" he said eventually. "A little. My father had 2. I helped with them." "You got a good eye," he said. "I can see you watching them. Most people look at horses and see horses. You look at horses and see what they're thinking." She hadn't known how to respond to that. She'd said thank you, which felt inadequate. "Caleb's a good man," Hutch said, apparently moving to a different subject, and then not explaining the connection. "He's not easy, but he's good. Took me a while to know the difference." He pushed off the fence and went back to his work, and Elsie went back to watching the horses, and the conversation was over. She thought about it for several days afterward. None. Isabella was the one who made the days bearable in those first weeks, though she did it without fanfare and without any apparent awareness of doing it. She was not demonstrative. She did not hug Elsie or call her endearments or treat her with the exaggerated tenderness that Elsie had seen some adults adopt around children they felt sorry for. Isabella treated her instead with the same direct, practical attention she brought to everything else, which was actually much more useful. She showed Elsie how to make biscuits and how to tend the kitchen garden even in winter and how to bank a fire so it lasted through the night. She taught her where things were and how they worked and why. Not presenting information but explaining it, which was a distinction Elsie noticed and valued. When Elsie made mistakes, and she made them, burning the bottom of a pot one afternoon and dropping an entire jar of preserved peaches that shattered across the kitchen floor, Isabella did not yell or sigh heavily or make her feel like a catastrophe. "Clean it up," Isabella said when the peach jar went. That was all. Elsie cleaned it up. She understood in those weeks that there was a difference between being tolerated and being wanted, and that she was currently somewhere in the space between the two. She was being permitted. She was being cared for in the practical sense. But the question of what she was exactly, a temporary problem, a charity case, a fixture, was still open, and she could feel its openness like a draft through a badly hung door. She did not ask about it. She helped Isabella. She watched Pearl's stone bruise heal slowly, checking on her every morning and reporting to Caleb in the evenings with the same brief, precise language he seemed to prefer. The rope had appeared in Pearl's stall within 2 days of their conversation in the barn, hung from a beam where the horse could push it with her nose, and Pearl, true to Elsie's prediction, was considerably more settled. Caleb said nothing about it, but she noticed him watching her with the horse. On the 16th day, one of the Falk brothers, Roy, the older one, who had a tendency to say out loud the things most people kept inside, said something in the yard that Elsie was not supposed to hear. She was around the side of the barn, carrying a water bucket, and Roy and Dennis were on the other side, not bothering to lower their voices. "Can't keep a stray child forever," Roy was saying. "It's not a working ranch. It's an orphanage." "Caleb hasn't said anything," Dennis said. "Caleb doesn't say much about anything. Doesn't mean he's thought it through. Girl's gonna need somewhere to go. County seat, maybe. Some placement." Elsie stood on the other side of the barn wall with the water bucket and waited for something inside her to crack. It didn't. She waited a moment longer, then carried the bucket where it was going. That evening, after supper, Caleb pushed back from the table and seemed like he was about to get up, and Elsie said, before she'd fully decided to say it, "Roy thinks you should send me to the county seat." Caleb stopped, looked at her. "Heard that, did you?" "I wasn't trying to. I was carrying water." He was quiet. He had the look he got sometimes, the one that meant something was working behind his eyes that he wasn't ready to put into words. "What do you think?" he said. She hadn't expected that. She picked up her fork even though she'd finished eating just to have something to do with her hands. "I think Roy's not wrong that I can't stay here forever on no terms," she said. "I'm not a guest. I want to be useful. I'm already helping Isabella. I could do more, with the horses or whatever else needs doing. I'm not asking for... I don't need much. I can work." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. His face was doing that careful, closed thing it did when he was thinking something he hadn't decided yet. "You're 9, he said. "I know how old I am." The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't a smile exactly, but it was something adjacent to one. "Go to bed, Elsie," he said. She went. She lay in the dark in the small room off the kitchen and held the wooden horse and thought about what she'd said. She wasn't sure if it had been smart or desperate or both. She'd spoken before she'd planned to, which her father had always said was either a gift or a problem depending on the situation. She fell asleep before she knew which one it was going to be. The next morning, Caleb was at the table when she came out, which was unusual. He was normally long gone by the time she woke. He had a cup of coffee in both hands and was looking at the table. Isabella was at the stove, back turned, clearly performing the very deliberate act of being busy with something else. Caleb looked up when Elsie came in. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about why things are the way they are here." She waited. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup, staring into it for a moment. He was not a man who found talking about himself easy, and she could feel the difficulty of it in the way he held himself, the particular tension of someone who had decided to say a thing and was still negotiating with himself about how. "I had a wife," he said, "and a son, 7 years ago. We were building this place up. It was smaller then, and rougher, and we'd had a bad spring and a worse summer, and there was a sickness that came through the territory. My wife caught it." He paused. "She was 3 months along with our second when she got sick. We lost both of them. My boy, he was 4. He caught it 2 weeks later and didn't recover." The kitchen was very quiet. "I'm sorry," Elsie said, because she was. "I'm telling you this because I need you to understand what this place is," he said. "It's a working ranch. It's not a home the way it maybe should be. I haven't known how to make it one. For a long time I didn't see any reason to." He looked at her directly. "I still don't know what I'm doing," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not promising you anything I don't know if I can keep, but I'm not sending you to the county seat. Not now." He paused. "Roy needs to keep his opinions to himself. I'll tell him so." Elsie looked at him. He was not offering her warmth. He was not offering her a family. He was offering her something more cautious than that, and more honest. An acknowledgement that he was figuring something out, and that she was part of what he was figuring. She thought she could work with that. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. Isabella put a plate of biscuits on the table without comment, then went back to the stove. February came in brutal and stayed that way. 3 of the herd got loose in a fence break during a night storm, and the recovery operation took 2 freezing days and left Roy Falk with a badly wrenched shoulder and Hutch with a split lip from a panicked horse. Miguel got his boot stuck in mud so deep it took 3 men and a rope to retrieve him, and arrived back at the barn looking so thoroughly shaken that even Elsie felt sorry for him. She brought him a cup of hot coffee after, which he accepted with a slightly stunned expression. "How old are you?" he said. 9? "Dios mío," he said, which she didn't understand but gathered was some form of incredulity. She went back to her work. It was during those 2 hard recovery days that she noticed something. When the men came in at the end of the first day, cold and exhausted and short-tempered, Caleb moved through the barn doing something she hadn't seen him do before, checking on each of them. Not with words, exactly. He handed Roy something for the shoulder, talked to Hutch for a moment about the horse that had split his lip, clapped Miguel on the back in a brief, wordless gesture that somehow communicated about 4 sentences worth of meaning. It was fast and quiet and looked almost like nothing. But it wasn't nothing. She understood, watching him, what Hutch had meant about good and easy being different things. Later that night, she was in Pearl's stall, The horse had finally been cleared to walk, and Elsie had gotten into the habit of spending an hour with her in the evenings, just moving her slowly up and down the barn aisle when she heard Caleb come into the barn. He stopped at the aisle and watched her walk Pearl for a few turns. "How's she feeling?" he said. "Even on both sides now," Elsie said. "She's not favoring it anymore." "Yeah, I can see that." He leaned on the aisle gate, arms folded. "Where'd you learn to move a horse like that? Slow?" "My father said you could learn more about a horse's soundness in 10 minutes of walking than an hour of trotting, because at the trot they can compensate, hide things. At the walk you see everything." Caleb looked at her. "Smart man," he said. "He was," she said. She didn't mean for her voice to do what it did on those two words, catch slightly, go a fraction too, even the way voices do when they're controlling something. But it happened, and she felt it happen, and she kept walking Pearl and waited for it to pass. From behind her, she heard Caleb move away from the gate. She thought he was leaving. Instead, he came into the aisle and fell into step on Pearl's other side, walking with them. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. They walked the old gray mare up and down the barn aisle in the lamplight for another 10 minutes, their breath-making clouds in the cold air. The horse moving evenly between them, heeled and quiet, her hooves soft on the packed dirt. It was the most companionable 10 minutes Elsie had experienced in a very long time. When she finally put Pearl back in her stall, she looked up and found Caleb watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Open, unguarded, slightly troubled, the face of a man who'd felt something shift and wasn't entirely sure what to do about it. "Good night, Elsie," he said. "Good night, Mr. Mercer." He started to go. "Caleb," she said. He stopped. She wasn't sure why she'd said it, maybe because calling him Mr. Mercer had started to feel wrong in a way she couldn't explain, too formal for a man she walked horses with in the lamplight. He turned and looked at her. He didn't seem offended. He seemed, if anything, like he was waiting. "Thank you," she said, "for not sending me away." He looked at her for a long moment. "Go to bed," he said quietly. And then, just before he pulled the barn door open, "Thank you for the rope idea. Pearl's been calmer." The door closed behind him. Elsie stood in the warm barn with the horses moving softly in their stalls around her, and felt something she hadn't felt in so long that it took her a moment to recognize it. Not happiness, exactly. Something quieter. Something that didn't make promises but didn't take them away either. The possibility of belonging to a place. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. Spring came to the Montana Territory the way it always did. Not all at once, not with any particular announcement, but in pieces, like something being assembled by a person who wasn't entirely sure of the design. A week of hard freeze followed by 2 days of thaw. Ice on the creek loosening at the edges while the center held. The horses growing restless in their stalls, pressing against the gate boards in the morning with the particular impatience of animals who could smell a season changing. Elsie noticed it first in Pearl. The gray mare had been fully sound for 3 weeks by then, cleared for light work, and Elsie had been the one to begin it, walking her in the paddock in the mornings before the ranch hands came out, getting her used to movement again after the long stall rest. It had been Caleb's idea, or something close to one. He'd said, one evening at supper, that Pearl needed gradual work, and that Hutch was too heavy-handed for the job, and Miguel was too nervous around the horse since she'd spooked him in February. He'd said it to the table in general, and not to Elsie specifically, but they'd both known what he meant. So Elsie did it. She was out there every morning in the gray pre-dawn cold, moving Pearl in slow circles while the rest of the ranch was still waking up. She didn't mind the cold anymore, or at least she minded it less than she had when she'd first arrived. She'd learned the difference between cold that was dangerous and cold that was merely uncomfortable, which was a distinction that mattered out here. And she wore the distinction like the extra layer Isabella had sewn into her coat without comment sometime in January. She was in the paddock one morning in late March, Pearl moving well on a long line, when she heard the creak of the paddock gate and turned to find Caleb leaning on it, watching. She didn't stop Pearl. She kept the line steady and let the mare move. "Good extension on that near foreleg," Caleb said. "She's finally using herself right," Elsie said. "For the first 2 weeks she was still protecting it. Now she's forgotten to." How do you know the difference? The protecting looks deliberate. This looks like she stopped thinking about it. He was quiet for a moment, watching Pearl move. The morning light was just starting, thin and pale, and it caught the gray of the mare's coat and made her look almost silver. I want to put you up on her, he said. Elsie looked at him. She needs someone light, he said. Someone she trusts. I've been thinking about it. I've ridden before, Elsie said. Not a lot. My father let me ride the plow horse. Pearl's not a plow horse. I know what she is. He looked at her steadily. You scared? She thought about it honestly. A little, but that seems right. He nodded. Come Saturday. We'll see how she goes. He pushed off the gate and went back across the yard, and Elsie turned back to Pearl, who had drawn up and was watching Caleb's retreating figure with the mild curiosity of a horse who was interested in people without being particularly impressed by them. Saturday, Elsie told her. Pearl flicked an ear. Well, Saturday arrived and was cold and clear, the kind of morning that felt like an apology for the weeks of gray that had preceded it. Caleb was in the barn when Elsie got there, already brushing Pearl down with the particular focused attention he brought to all physical work. He didn't say good morning. He handed her a softer brush. They worked in silence, side by side, getting Pearl ready. When the saddle went on, a smaller one that had appeared in the tack room sometime that week without explanation, sized for a lighter rider, Elsie stood back and watched Caleb check the cinch and adjust the stirrups and run his hand down Pearl's back, checking. He was thorough in a way that was not theatrical. He wasn't performing caution. He simply was cautious, the way careful people are, without needing anyone to notice. All right, he said. He held the stirrup and she got up. Pearl shifted her weight once beneath her, a small adjustment, and then went still. Elsie sat and breathed and let her hands be soft on the reins the way her father had taught her. Not gripping, not abandoning, just present. How does she feel? Caleb said. Like she's listening, Elsie said. Good. Walk her. Just a walk. Don't ask her for anything she doesn't offer. They spent an hour in the paddock, Pearl walking, then a careful trot when Pearl offered it, then walking again. Caleb stood at the fence and watched with the particular stillness of a man who was paying complete attention and keeping his reaction entirely to himself. He did not offer praise, he offered corrections, quiet, specific ones. Shorten your left rein, you're pulling. Sit back, let her make the corner. Elsie did not mind the corrections. They told her he was watching carefully, and being watched carefully by someone who knew what they were looking at felt different from being monitored for mistakes. At the end of the hour, she brought Pearl back to the fence and dismounted. Caleb took the reins. He ran his hand down Pearl's neck, checking her over with that same quiet thoroughness. You have good hands, he said. She looked at him. Your father taught you that too? He showed me the basics. The rest I figured out. She paused. Or Pearl did. Something moved in his face. He handed her the reins and went to get the brushes. They untacked Pearl together, and it was during the routine work of it, both of them moving around the horse without getting in each other's way, that Elsie realized they had stopped bumping into each other weeks ago. Somewhere without marking the moment, they'd learned each other's movements. She knew he would take the saddle. She took the pad. She knew he checked the left knee before the right on this particular horse. She stayed out of that side until he was done. It was a small thing. But small things, Elsie had learned, were where the real information was. April brought mud and longer days and a ranch hand named Co, who showed up looking for work and was hired by Caleb after a 10-minute conversation that Elsie watched from the barn door without quite meaning to. Co was somewhere around 30, with a pleasant face and an easy manner, and the particular social fluency of someone who'd gotten through life largely on being liked. He was good with the horses in a showy way. He had a nice, easy seat and rode beautifully, which the Falk brothers admired loudly. Hutch did not comment on Co's riding. Elsie noticed that. She noticed other things, too. Co was the kind of person who found reasons to be wherever Caleb was, who laughed at whatever Caleb said, who had an opinion ready on every subject that turned out to align, after a few exchanges, with whatever Caleb's opinion appeared to be. It was skillful. It probably worked on most people. She didn't think it was working on Caleb, but she wasn't sure. She stayed out of Coe's way, which was easy enough. She had plenty to do. Isabella noticed her noticing. One afternoon in the kitchen, cutting vegetables for supper, Isabella said, without looking up from her work, "You don't trust him." Elsie looked up. "Who?" "You know who." She went back to cutting. "He's too agreeable," she said. "Some people are just friendly." Friendly and agreeable are different things. Friendly people have opinions. Agreeable people have strategies. Isabella looked at her then, with the expression she got sometimes. The one that was almost a smile but was really something more serious than that, a kind of recognition. "Your father," she said. "He told me to read people in the first few minutes," Elsie said. "I've been reading Coe for 3 weeks. And? I don't know what he wants yet, but he wants something." Isabella went back to her cutting. After a moment she said, "Tell me if you figure it out, San." It was Hutch who confirmed it, in his sideways, indirect way, on a Tuesday afternoon when Elsie was sitting on the fence watching the horses, and he came and leaned beside her. "You know Coe came in from the Alger spread," Hutch said, apparently to the middle distance. Elsie looked at him. "I didn't know that." "Worked there 2 seasons. Left before they had their trouble." He picked up a piece of straw and put it between his teeth. "The Alger spread had a problem last year with deed documentation. Turned out the owner had been borrowing against the land with a man named Harlan Greer out of Helena. When the owner died, Greer moved on the property inside of a month. Whole family was out by spring." Elsie sat with that for a moment. Harlan Greer. Landman, lawyer type, though I've heard he's not exactly a lawyer in the formal sense. Has some kind of arrangement with the territorial courts, is what people say. Works in the spaces where the law isn't looking real hard. And Coe worked for the Alger family before all that happened. Left before it happened, Hutch said. That's the part I keep thinking on. He took the straw out of his mouth. Maybe it's nothing, he said. Maybe Coe just wanted a new situation, and here was a good one. Maybe I'm a suspicious old man who's been on the frontier too long. Or maybe he left because he knew it was coming, Elsie said. Hutch looked at her sideways. You're 9. I know, she said. He pushed off the fence. I've got no proof of anything, he said, and Caleb doesn't like speculation without evidence. I've tried him on that. So you're telling me, she said. I'm telling you because you're the one who notices things, and because you spend time in places I don't. He looked at her directly for a moment. Keep your eyes open. He walked away. Elsie sat on the fence and looked at the horses and thought about Harlan Greer of Helena and about a spread that had been taken from a family in less than a month and about a man who'd left before it happened. She thought about what Caleb had said to her in February. I'm not promising you anything I don't know if I can keep. And about the ranch, which was large and solid and probably worth a great deal to the right kind of person. She thought about the wooden horse on her windowsill and her father's voice. People are mostly decent, Elsie. Mostly. She started paying closer attention to Coe. Not obviously. She was 9, and one of the things about being 9 in a world run by adults was that you could be invisible if you wanted to be. People didn't guard their conversations when a child was nearby, or if they did, they stopped after a while when the child just kept being quiet and unremarkable. She'd learned this in the 2 years with Dorothy, when being small and unobtrusive had been a survival strategy. Now she used it differently. She noticed that Coe asked questions, casual, friendly questions that didn't seem like much individually. Questions about the ranch's size, about the water rights on the north pasture, about whether Caleb had a lawyer he dealt with regular, about whether the deed was filed at the territorial office or the county one. Any one of those questions, in isolation, was nothing. A man getting familiar with a new place. Normal. She counted 7 of them in 2 weeks, she told Isabella. Isabella listened to all of it without interrupting, standing at the kitchen counter with her hands flat on the surface, looking at nothing in particular. When Elsie finished, Isabella was quiet for a long moment. You need to tell Caleb, she said. Hutch said he doesn't like speculation without evidence. What you just described to me isn't speculation. It's a pattern. Isabella looked at her directly. Caleb will listen if you come to him with facts and not feelings. He's that kind of man. What if he thinks I'm being a child making up things? Then we'll deal with that. But I don't think he will. She paused. He's been watching you for 4 months, Elsie. He knows by now that you don't say things you don't mean. Elsie held that. Tonight, Isabella said, after supper. Okay. She told him after supper, when the table was cleared and the ranch hands had gone to the bunkhouse. She sat across from him the way she had that first night, with the lantern between them, and she laid it out in the order she'd assembled it. Hutch's information about the Alger spread, the questions she'd catalogued, the dates. She did not editorialize. She did not say what she thought it meant. She put the facts on the table like pieces of something and let him look at them. Caleb sat very still and listened to all of it. He did not interrupt her. He did not look skeptical or dismissive. He looked like a man who was filing information. When she finished, he looked at the table for a while. Harlan Greer, he said. That's the name Hutch gave me. I know who Harlan Greer is, he said. And something in his voice when he said it told her that this name was not new to him, that it had history attached that she wasn't aware of. He got up from the table and went to the window and stood there looking out at the dark yard. How many questions? He said. 7 that I counted. There might be more. In how many days? 14. He was quiet for a long time. You did right, he said finally. He didn't turn from the window. Telling me. Hutch tried to tell you, and you don't like speculation. Hutch told me someone left a troubled spread before the trouble. That's speculation. He turned then. What you just told me is a record. That's different. She looked at him. Co is leaving in the morning, he said. What will you tell him? That I don't need the extra hand now that the spring work is settling. That's true enough. He moved away from the window and picked up the lantern to carry it to the mantel. I'll also be riding into Helena next week. There's some paperwork I've been putting off. She understood that he meant the deed. She didn't say so. Go to bed, Elsie. She stood up. At the kitchen doorway, she stopped. Caleb. He looked at her. Be careful in Helena, she said. Hutch said Greer has arrangements with the territorial courts. He looked at her for a long moment, with that expression she'd come to recognize, the one that was not quite what anyone would call warm, but that had something behind it that was real and specific and directed entirely at her. I will, he said. See, Co left the next morning. He was pleasant about it, which was the most unsettling thing. He shook hands with the Falk brothers and clapped Miguel on the shoulder and thanked Caleb in the easy, agreeable way he did everything, and then he climbed on his horse and rode out and didn't look back. And Elsie watched him from the barn door and tried to read whether he was leaving as a man who'd been discovered or a man who'd failed at a task, and couldn't quite tell. Hutch appeared at her elbow. You told him, he said. I told Caleb. He made his own decision. Hutch was quiet for a moment, watching the retreating figure. Good girl, he said, in the way he said most things, as a plain statement of fact, not a performance of praise. She went back into the barn. The unsettled feeling didn't leave. If anything, it got heavier over the following days, the way a sky gets heavier before a storm. Not obviously dramatic, but noticeably changed. Caleb rode to Helena on Wednesday and came back on Friday and told her nothing about what he'd found. And she didn't ask, because asking would have been pushing past the boundary of what she was, which was still undefined. She was here. She was useful. She was not yet something that had a name. The not knowing sat in her chest, and she carried it the way she'd learned to carry things, without letting it slow her down. She was in Pearl's stall on a Friday evening, the week after Caleb came back from Helena, when she heard the sound of a wagon coming up the ranch road. She came out of the stall and stood in the barn door. It was near dark, and the wagon was moving too fast for the ruts in the road, the horse pulling it pushed harder than it needed to be. Someone in a hurry. Someone who knew where they were going. She watched it pull into the yard. The woman on the wagon bench was not someone Elsie recognized at first, or told herself she didn't, for the 3 or 4 seconds between seeing the figure and knowing, with a cold and absolute certainty, exactly who it was. Dorothy Vane had not changed. She was still compact and efficient-looking, still held the reins with that particular flat-handed competence. She climbed down from the wagon bench the way she did everything, without wasted motion, without self-consciousness, already looking around the yard for whatever she'd come to find. She found it. She found Elsie. For a moment, they just looked at each other across the darkening yard, and Elsie felt something happen in her body that wasn't fear exactly and wasn't anger exactly, but was something composed of both. A cold rush, starting in her chest and spreading outward, the physical sensation of a threat she recognized. Dorothy's expression, crossing the yard toward her, was not cruel. It was composed, businesslike. The face of a woman who had decided on an approach and was executing it. "Elsie," she said. Not warm, not sorry, just the name, stated, like a claim. Elsie did not answer. "I've been looking for you," Dorothy said. She stopped a few feet away. She was looking Elsie over the way she'd always looked her over, taking inventory, assessing condition. "I'm here," Elsie said. "Yes, I can see that." She looked at the barn, the house, the yard. At the ranch around them, its evident size and solidity. "I'd like to speak with whoever is responsible for you." "Why?" Dorothy's eyes came back to her. "Because you're a child, and you're not where you should be." The door of the main house opened. Caleb came out. He took in the scene in one quick look. Elsie standing in the barn door, the woman in the yard, the wagon, and walked across the yard with the unhurried, deliberate pace of a man who was in no rush and was not going to be hurried. "Evening," he said. He stopped a few feet from Dorothy, between her and Elsie, without making it obvious that was what he was doing. "Caleb Mercer, this is my ranch." "Dorothy Vane," she said. "I've come for the girl." "Have you?" It was not a question. It was a statement with an edge behind it that Elsie recognized. The particular tone of a man who had decided something and was merely waiting for the conversation to catch up. "She's my husband's daughter," Dorothy said. "My responsibility." "Your husband's been dead for 5 months," Caleb said. Something moved in Dorothy's face. She hadn't expected him to know that. "Regardless of the circumstances, you left her in the middle of open territory in January," Caleb said. "Alone, with a blanket and a bag of crackers." "I did what I had to do under difficult conditions," Dorothy said, and her voice was so even, so entirely without apology, that Elsie felt the old cold fury of recognizing someone who genuinely believed their own account. "I was a widow, alone, with a journey ahead of me. I made an impossible decision. I'm here now because I've had time to reconsider," Caleb said. "To do right by the girl," Dorothy said. "Why now?" he said. Dorothy paused. Just a fraction of a second, but Elsie caught it. "I heard she'd been found and taken in," Dorothy said. "Word travels." "It does," Caleb said. "Word about a big ranch travels particularly well." The silence that followed had a specific weight. Dorothy held his look. She was not easily rattled. Elsie knew that. You didn't rattle Dorothy Vane by implying something. She just adjusted her angle of approach. "I'm not looking for trouble," Dorothy said. "I'm looking for the girl. She's my legal responsibility as my late husband's widow and his only surviving family." "She's not your blood. You told her so yourself." "The law in this territory doesn't concern itself with blood. It concerns itself with documentation." "Then you'll need to bring your documentation to a court," Caleb said, "because she's not going anywhere tonight." Dorothy looked at him for a long moment. She looked at Elsie, and Elsie saw it then, the thing that had always been true about Dorothy Vane, the thing she'd been too young and too close to name before. Dorothy was not cruel in the way of people who enjoyed cruelty. She was transactional. She evaluated what was in front of her and decided what it was worth and acted accordingly. She had left Elsie in the wilderness because Elsie had been worth nothing to her then. A liability, a cost, a burden without return. Something had changed. Elsie was worth something now. She didn't know yet exactly what, or how Dorothy had come to know it. She thought about leaving without looking back, and about Harlan Greer, and about arrangements with territorial courts, and she put those things alongside the timing of Dorothy's arrival. 5 months after the abandonment, 1 week after Caleb came back from Helena, and she felt the shape of something that she didn't have enough pieces yet to see whole. "I'll be in the settlement at Granger's Creek," Dorothy said. "I'll expect to hear from you within the week." She walked back to her wagon, got up, picked up the reins. She didn't look at Elsie again. She drove out. The sound of the wagon faded into the dark. Caleb stood in the yard for a long moment. Then he turned. Elsie was holding the barn door gate with both hands, the wood solid under her fingers, her knuckles white. She made herself loosen her grip. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah." "She doesn't want me," Elsie said. "She never wanted me. This is something else." He looked at her steadily. "I know." "Then what?" "Come inside," he said. "Isabella needs to hear this." He walked to the house. After a moment, Elsie followed. The wooden horse was on her windowsill where she'd left it, carved oak worn smooth by years of hands, carrying whatever luck it still had in it. She hoped it had enough left. That night, around the kitchen table with the lantern turned up high, Caleb laid out what he'd found in Helena. He did it the way he did most things, without preamble, without softening, in the flat, direct manner of a man who thought the truth was easier to deal with than the careful version of it. He put a folded paper on the table, then another, then a third. Isabella stood at the counter with her arms crossed. Elsie sat across from him with her hands in her lap. "Harlan Greer filed a preliminary interest claim on this property in February," Caleb said, "based on a debt instrument. A loan my father took out in 1869 before he died, before I inherited the ranch. Greer bought the debt from the original creditor sometime last year. Under territorial law, if the debt is considered valid and outstanding, he has a standing claim." Isabella looked at the papers. "Is it valid?" "My father paid it," Caleb said. "I watched him do it. I was 17 and I remember it clearly. The problem is the payment receipt is gone. There's no documentation on our side." "Gone how?" Isabella said. "The office fire in 71. County Record Building took a bad fire and lost about 4 years of documentation. The original creditor is dead. His son says he has no records of the transaction." He paused. "I'm not saying the son is lying. I'm saying he may not know, or the records may genuinely be gone, or he may be lying. I can't tell yet which." Elsie looked at the papers, then at Caleb. "So Greer is claiming you owe a debt that was already paid, and there's nothing to prove it was paid." "That's the shape of it." "And Coe was asking about water rights and deeds," she said. "Coe was mapping what was worth taking," Caleb said. "If a claim like this goes through the territorial court, Greer doesn't just get money. He gets to force a sale to recover the debt, at the price he sets, because there's no competing bid when the sale is forced." Isabella sat down. She looked at the papers with the expression of someone reading the terms of something deeply unfair, written in perfectly legal language. "The wagon train," Elsie said. Both of them looked at her. She was working through it out loud, slower than she wanted to. "Dorothy said she heard I'd been found and taken in. Word travels," she said. "But she came here, to this ranch specifically, not just to find me somewhere." She looked at Caleb. She knew whose ranch this was. "Yes," he said. "So someone told her. Someone who knew where I was and who you were and what this ranch was worth." She paused. "Coe left before you went to Helena. He had 2 weeks' worth of questions answered." Caleb was watching her. "Go on. If Dorothy comes in and claims legal guardianship over me, and if Greer is moving on the debt claim at the same time." She stopped because she could see the shape of it, and it was uglier than she'd initially thought. "She doesn't need me. She needs to be here. In a court proceeding over my custody, about who is responsible for me, you'd have to prove you have the right to keep me. And while you're doing that—" "Greer moves on the property," Caleb said quietly. The kitchen was very still. "Two fronts," Isabella said. "One pulls his attention and resources. The other takes the ground." "It's not a new trick," Caleb said. "I should have seen it coming." He said it without self-pity, the way he acknowledged all his errors, directly, as fact, and then moved on. "You couldn't have known she was connected to Greer," Isabella said. "I could have looked harder when I was in Helena." He picked up the papers and folded them. "I'll fix that." Elsie watched him. There was a specific quality to Caleb Mercer in a moment like this one. A kind of stillness that was not passivity, but its opposite. The stillness of a man consolidating rather than retreating. She'd seen it in February when the fence broke and the cattle scattered and Roy came in panicked. Caleb had gone quieter, not louder, and that quiet had organized everything around it. "Who do you know in Helena?" she asked. He looked at her. "A lawyer," she said. "Someone who knows the territorial court." "There's a man named Aldous Webb," he said. He's handled some of my business before. I trust him within reason. Within reason, Isabella said. He's a lawyer. That's the most trust you can extend. You need to go back to Helena, Elsie said. Soon, before Dorothy does anything formal. I know. And you need to find out how she's connected to Greer. Because if you can show the court that the custody claim and the debt claim are coordinated, it changes what this looks like. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He was looking at her with that expression she'd seen before, but still hadn't entirely gotten used to. The one that wasn't quite surprise, but was in the same neighborhood. You're 9, he said. Hutch keeps reminding me, she said. The edge of his mouth moved. He picked up the papers and stood. Go to bed, he said. I'm leaving for Helena at first light. She went, but she lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the house. Caleb moving in the front room, papers shuffling, the low exchange of voices between him and Isabella that she couldn't make out. The wooden horse was on the sill, and the moonlight was doing something to it, making the carved mane cast a small shadow across the sill boards. She thought about Dorothy's face in the yard, the inventory look, the claim in her voice when she'd said Elsie's name. She thought about her father's hands carving that horse, carving it slowly, carefully, because you couldn't do it right if you were in a hurry. She thought, I will not be taken. She didn't say it out loud. She thought it the way you think something you mean to keep. Then she closed her eyes. Eat. Caleb was gone for 4 days. They were long days, and not comfortable ones. Isabella was brisk and efficient in the particular way she got when she was worried. Cleaning things that didn't need cleaning, reorganizing shelves that were already organized, cooking in quantities that suggested she was feeding an army rather than a ranch of 6. Elsie helped her and stayed out of her way in equal measure, and rode Pearl in the mornings and kept her observations about the mood of the household to herself. On the second day, Roy Falk said, loudly enough to be heard across the yard, that a man who left his ranch for 4 days in spring with work undone was making a mistake he'd regret. Hutch said, Roy. Roy said, what? Hutch said, shut up. Roy shut up. On the third day, a rider came through with a letter. He asked for Isabella by name, handed it over, and was gone before Elsie had come down from the paddock fence. She found Isabella in the kitchen with the letter open on the table, reading it with the kind of focused attention that meant the content was not casual. Is it from Caleb? Elsie said. No. Isabella looked up. It's from Dorothy Vane. She's filed a petition with the county court. Formal guardianship claim. She set the letter down. She says she's offering me the courtesy of notification as the household manager and that she expects the matter to be resolved within the month. The word courtesy sat on the table between them like something that had been left there by mistake. She sent it here, Elsie said. To you. Because Caleb isn't here, Isabella said. She knows he isn't here. She's been watching the ranch. Or someone has been watching it for her. Isabella folded the letter. She looked at Elsie for a moment. A long, assessing look that had something behind it that Elsie hadn't seen from her before. Not worry exactly. Something more like determination getting its coat on. Can I see it? Elsie said. Isabella handed it over. Elsie read it carefully, twice. The language was formal and careful and filed with phrases she only half understood, but the structure of it she followed well enough. Dorothy was claiming that as Thomas Carter's widow, she retained guardianship responsibility over his minor child regardless of the circumstance of their separation. She used the word separation, not abandonment, not I left her in the wilderness to freeze, and that the child's current placement with an unrelated party had not been authorized through any proper legal channel. Unauthorized placement. That was what she was calling it, as if Elsie had been accidentally left somewhere, like luggage. She put the letter down. She's been talking to someone who knows the law, she said. Greer, Isabella said, or Greer's people. She smoothed the letter on the table, a gesture that had no practical purpose and that she did anyway, just to do something with her hands. There's a word she used, separation. She said it twice. Isabella looked at the letter. She's not going to say she abandoned me, Elsie said. She's going to say we got separated, that she's been looking for me, that this is a reunion, And not a, she stopped, not a claim. Can you prove otherwise? The people on the wagon train saw it. Mrs. Brenner. She gave me biscuits and said she was sorry and looked like she knew exactly what was happening. She thought, the wagon master. He would have seen Dorothy leave without me. Do you know where these people went, the wagon train? They were heading northwest, a settlement. I don't know the name. Isabella nodded slowly. When Caleb gets back. We need to find them before Dorothy does, Elsie said. If she finds them first. I know, Isabella said. When Caleb gets back. He came back on the evening of the fourth day, riding in just before dark with his horse carrying the particular exhaustion of too many miles too fast, and Caleb himself wearing the face of a man who had worked hard and learned things and wasn't done yet. He sat at the table. Isabella put food in front of him. He ate and talked at the same time, which he normally didn't do, which told Elsie how much he'd found and how much he needed to get through it. Greer and Dorothy Vane met in December, he said, in Butte. Webb traced it through a mutual associate, a notary who handled some papers for both of them. I don't have what the papers were yet, but the timing is 1 month before she left me, Elsie said. 1 month before. He looked at her. It's not proof of coordination. It's proximity. Webb says proximity is the beginning of a case, not the case itself. What else? The Alger family, he said. Hutch was right about Greer and the Alger spread. The family is in Missoula now, living with relatives. The widow, Ruth Alger, is willing to talk. She lost the property in March of last year. The debt claim Greer used against them had the same basic structure as the one against this ranch. Same territorial court filing, same language. He paused. Same notary. Isabella set down the dish she was holding. The same notary who handled Greer and Dorothy. The same one. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. That's a pattern, Elsie said. Webb says patterns are better than proximity, Caleb said. Still not proof, but it's enough to petition the court to delay the custody hearing until the debt claim is examined. You can't examine one without the other because they're the same instrument. Did Webb agree to take it? Isabella said. He took it. He's not cheap, and he'll tell you so himself loudly, but he's good. He pushed back from the table slightly. He's also going to need witnesses from the wagon train, people who saw what actually happened in January. Mrs. Brenner, Elsie said immediately, and the wagon master. His name was Alderman, but I remember because my father always called him by his full name, which was unusual. Last name? She thought. Alderman was his last name. I don't know his first. Wagon master named Alderman running trains northwest in January, Caleb said. Webb can find him. He looked at her. What do you remember about the morning she left you? Specific things, time, who was nearby, what was said. Elsie had not told that story in full to anyone. She'd given Caleb the outline of it that first night, and Isabella had understood most of it from context. She'd kept the specific details in a particular compartment, the way you keep things that are true and real, and also very painful. Not because she was afraid of them, but because taking them out required a steadiness she hadn't always been sure she had. She took a breath. She told it. She told it from the moment Dorothy had called her to the back of the wagon to the moment she'd watched the wagon train move away. She told it in the order it happened, with the details she remembered. The folded blanket, the specific words Dorothy had said, Mrs. Brenner's face, the biscuits wrapped in cloth, the sound of the wagon wheels. She told it steadily, not because she felt steady, but because she'd decided to be, because her father had taught her that the decision to hold yourself together was a thing you made, not a thing that happened to you. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Caleb's jaw was tight. He was looking at the table. Isabella had turned away toward the window, and Elsie could see the line of her shoulders and the particular stillness of someone controlling a feeling. She told you she couldn't afford extra weight, Caleb said. Those were her words. He nodded once. He picked up his coffee and set it down without drinking it. Webb will need to hear all of that, he said. He'll want to prepare you for what it's like to say it in a courtroom. Is that where this goes? She said. A courtroom? If Dorothy pushes the custody claim, yes. He looked at her directly. You don't have to be afraid of that. I'm not afraid of it, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Okay, he said. Good. I just need to know one thing, she said. What? She looked at him across the table, across the lantern light, across the 4 months of February cold and paddock work and barn silence and suppers and gradual, unannounced accumulation of a life shared in the same space. Are you fighting for me because she's connected to Greer and losing me means losing the ranch? She said. Or are you fighting for me because you want me here? She had not meant to ask it so directly. She'd meant to approach it sideways, the way you approach difficult things. But it had come out straight, the way things sometimes did when you were tired and scared and needed the truth more than you needed to be tactful about getting it. Caleb was very still. He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she started to wish she hadn't asked. Both, he said. She waited. I'm not going to lie to you, he said. The ranch matters. What Greer is doing matters. But if Dorothy had come here and had nothing to do with Greer, if she had just come here and said she wanted you back. He paused. He looked at the table. I would still fight for you. I want to be clear about that. She held that. I'm not good at saying things like this, he said. I haven't been good at it in a long time, but I want you to know that when I ride into Helena and sit in that lawyer's office and pay more money than I like to think about, I'm doing it because this is where you belong, not just because it's convenient for my deed. The lantern light was warm and steady. Okay, she said. He looked at her. Okay? I believed you, she said. I just needed to hear it. Something moved in his face. Not a smile, not quite, but its precursor, the thing that existed just before. Go to bed, Elsie. She went. Awesome. The weeks that followed had a particular texture, not dramatic in their individual moments, but dense with consequence, every ordinary day undercut by the knowledge of what was assembling in the territorial court. Webb rode out to the ranch twice and sat at the kitchen table with papers, and asked Elsie questions in the careful, methodical way of someone building an architecture. He was not warm and not cold. He was professional, which was a quality Elsie had come to associate with people who took her seriously as a source of information. He asked her to tell him the story 3 times, and each time he stopped her at different points and asked for specifics. He wrote things down in a small notebook with a very short pencil. You have a good memory, he said, after the 3rd telling. I remember things that mattered, she said. Most people remember those. The question is whether they remember them accurately or whether they remember the way they felt about them. He looked at her over his notebook. With you, I'm not finding much difference between the two. My father said feelings were information, she said. Not always accurate information, but information. You had to know which was which. Webb looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who was unexpectedly impressed by something. Smart man, he said. He was, she said. Webb found the wagon master, a process Elsie was not privy to, but heard described secondhand by Caleb on a Tuesday evening. Alderman was in a settlement north of the territory, still running freight, and had remembered the Carter wagon, remembered Thomas Carter's death, and most importantly remembered the morning the train had moved on. He had seen Dorothy prepare Elsie's bundle. He had seen the girl left behind. He had not intervened because he'd believed Dorothy had the right to make decisions about her husband's child, and because the frontier made people pragmatic in ways they weren't always proud of after. He was willing to testify to what he'd seen. Mrs. Brenner was harder to find. She'd settled somewhere in the territory, and her husband's name was common enough that it took Webb's contact network 2 weeks to locate them. When they did, she wrote a letter. Not a testimony, not yet, but a letter that confirmed the outline of events and said she would speak to it if asked. That's 2 witnesses to the morning itself, Webb told Caleb, and Ruth Alger to establish Greer's pattern, and the notary connection, which I've had confirmed by a second source. He stacked his papers. Dorothy's attorney, she has one now, out of Butte, is going to argue that what happened in January was a tragic decision made under duress, not abandonment. He'll say she's been searching for the girl since. He'll say her legal claim as widow supersedes any informal arrangement. And the Greer connection, Caleb said. They'll say it's coincidence, 2 separate legal matters that happen to involve related parties. He paused. which is why we need to be careful about how we present it. If we lead with the conspiracy angle, we look like we're making things up to protect the land. If we lead with the child's welfare and let the connection emerge from the evidence, the court sees it differently. Let the pattern speak, Caleb said. Exactly. Elsie, sitting at the end of the table, said, "What does the court actually care about, the child or the property?" Both men looked at her. In theory, Webb said carefully, the court's function in a custody matter is the welfare of the child. In practice? Webb looked at her for a moment. In practice, the court is made up of people. People respond to what they can see. So we need them to see the right things in the right order, she said. Yes, Webb said. She nodded. She looked at Caleb. I want to testify. Caleb's expression shifted. Webb will handle, I know what Webb will handle, she said. I want to testify myself. I want to tell the court what happened in my own words. She paused. Webb said people respond to what they can see. They should see me. A silence at the table. Webb was looking at her with the calculating attention of someone considering a tactical option he hadn't initially included. She's not wrong, he said to Caleb. Caleb looked at her. He didn't look pleased. He looked like a man who understood something he would have preferred not to be true. It'll be hard, he said. I know. Dorothy's lawyer will ask you questions that are designed to make you sound confused or unreliable or coached. I know. You'll have to sit in that room and say what happened in January in front of people you don't know, and say it clearly without... He stopped. Without falling apart, she said. Yes. She looked at him steadily. I've been doing hard things alone since January. This time I won't be alone. He held her look for a long moment. Then he nodded. Prepare her, he said to Webb. Cool. The hearing was set for the 3rd week of May, in the county seat in a building that smelled like wood dust and old paper, and the particular dry, institutional smell of rooms where decisions got made and recorded. Caleb had ridden in 2 days before with Elsie and Isabella because Webb wanted time with Elsie before the day, and because Caleb didn't trust the road timing. They stayed in the town's one boarding house, in 2 rooms, and ate supper at a table in the common room where people looked at them with the sideways curiosity of people who'd heard there was something interesting coming to court. The night before the hearing, Elsie couldn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the narrow boarding house bed and held the wooden horse and thought about what she was going to say, and about whether she would be able to say it right, and about the difference between knowing something and being able to make other people know it. There was a knock at her door. She said, "Come in." Caleb opened the door. He was still dressed, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. He looked at her sitting on the bed and at the wooden horse in her hands, and leaned against the doorframe. "You all right?" he said. "I'm thinking," she said. "About tomorrow?" "About whether the court will believe me over her." She paused. "She's an adult. She talks like she knows what she's doing. People believe adults who sound like they know what they're doing." "Some people," he said. "Not all?" "The ones in that room tomorrow." "Some of those too, but you're going to tell the truth, and the truth in this case is detailed and consistent and corroborated." He moved from the door frame and came and sat in the chair by the small window. "That's more than she has." "What does she have?" "A legal argument and a story she's been practicing." He looked at her. "You have what actually happened." Elsie looked down at the horse. "I keep thinking about what she said. Extra weight, like I was a bag of flour that was slowing the wagon down." He was quiet. "The thing is," she said, "she wasn't even mean about it. She didn't hate me. She just didn't think I counted." She paused. "That's almost worse." "It is worse," he said, "because it's harder to argue with. Hate is obvious. Indifference looks like practicality." She looked at him. "You're not indifferent." "No," he said. "I'm not." "How do I make the court see that? That you're not just keeping me for convenience?" "You tell them the truth about that too," he said. "What happened here? What you've been doing here? Who you are now versus who you were when I found you on the flats." He leaned forward. "You don't have to perform anything, Elsie. You just have to be exactly who you are. A 9-year-old girl who survived something genuinely hard and found her way to a place that is genuinely home. That's a story a courtroom can understand. She held that. You think it's home? She said. For me? He looked at her steadily. I think if it isn't yet, it's close enough that the difference doesn't matter for tomorrow, he said. And I think by the time that court makes its decision, it will be. The wooden horse was warm in her hands. Okay, she said. Get some sleep, he said. He stood. At the door, Caleb? He stopped. If it goes wrong tomorrow, she said. If they... She couldn't finish that sentence. She tried again. Whatever happens, I want you to know that you're the first person who picked me, after my father. You came down off that ridge and you picked me, and I don't forget things like that. He stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame and looked at her, and she saw something happen in his face that she suspected he would not have permitted if he'd been less tired or had more warning. He cleared his throat. It's not going to go wrong, he said. He pulled the door closed. Elsie sat in the quiet boarding house room with the wooden horse and listened to the sounds of the building settling around her, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something that was not quite peace but was pointed in that direction. Tomorrow was coming. She would be ready. The morning of the hearing came in gray and cold for May, which felt appropriate somehow. Not dramatic, not the kind of weather that announced itself, just overcast and still and serious, the way the day actually was. Elsie dressed without rushing. She had one good dress, the one Isabella had made her in March from fabric bought in the settlement. Dark blue wool, plain, with a white collar that buttoned cleanly at the throat. She'd argued mildly that it was too formal. Isabella had said, "You want that courtroom to look at you and see a child who is cared for, not a child who wanders in off the flats." Elsie had understood the logic and put the dress on. She put the wooden horse in her coat pocket. Not to show anyone, not as evidence or symbol or performance. Just because it was her father's, and today she wanted him as close as she could manage. They walked to the courthouse together, Caleb, Isabella, Elsie, and Webb, who met them at the door with his briefcase and the focused, unsmiling expression of a man who had organized everything he could organize and was now in the hands of the proceeding. He looked at Elsie once, quickly, the way a person checks that something important hasn't been forgotten. Ready? He said. Yes, she said. She was not entirely sure that was true, but she'd decided it was, which was close enough. The courtroom was smaller than she'd imagined. She didn't know what she'd imagined exactly. Something grander, perhaps, something that looked like the weight of its own function. Instead, it was a rectangular room with wooden benches, a judge's platform that was elevated just enough to make the point, 2 tables facing it, and windows along the south wall that let in the flat gray morning light without improving it. Dorothy was already there. She was sitting at the left table with a man in a dark coat who had the well-fed, deliberate look of an attorney who charged by the hour and knew it. She did not look at Elsie when they came in. She arranged her hands on the table in front of her and looked forward, composed, prepared. Elsie looked at her for a moment. Then she looked away and sat down beside Webb at the right table, and Caleb sat behind her on the first bench with Isabella at his side. The judge was a man named Carver, somewhere in his 60s, with a short white beard and the particular economy of movement of someone who had been conducting proceedings long enough to have stripped everything down to what was necessary. He came in without ceremony, sat, looked at both tables, and said, "We're here on the matter of guardianship for Elsie Carter, minor female, age 9, Mr. Webb for the respondent, Mr. Cole for the petitioner. Let's proceed." Dorothy's attorney, Cole, went first. He was good. Elsie had expected him to be good. And he was. He spoke in the measured, reasonable cadences of someone presenting a self-evident truth that only needed explaining rather than arguing. His client, he said, was the widow of Thomas Carter, the child's father. She had undertaken the extraordinary hardship of the westward journey in the months following her husband's death, a period of profound grief and practical crisis. In the chaos of that journey, the child had become separated from the wagon party. He said separated, just as the letter had, letting the word do its quiet work. Dorothy had immediately begun searching, had engaged the resources available to a woman traveling alone on the frontier, and had located the child in the care of an unrelated party without legal standing to retain her. She wanted her stepdaughter back, he said. She wanted to give the girl the stability and family continuity she deserved. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The story he was telling was coherent and sympathetic and only recognizable as a lie if you knew what had actually happened. Elsie sat straight and looked at the judge and kept her hands flat on the table. Webb's opening was shorter. He said that the evidence would show the child had not been separated. She had been deliberately abandoned in open territory in January, alone, with inadequate supplies at age 9. He said the evidence would further show that the petitioner's sudden interest in recovering the child was not motivated by maternal concern, but by a coordinated arrangement with a third party who had a financial interest in gaining access to the respondent's property. He said the court would hear from witnesses and from the child herself. The judge looked at both of them. Then he said, "Call your first witness." Alderman took the stand first. He was a solid, plain-spoken man, and he told what he'd seen the way a man tells something he is not proud of having done nothing about, directly, without embellishment, and with the particular heaviness of honest regret. He had seen Dorothy prepare the bundle. He had seen the child left standing in the road. He had made the decision not to intervene because he'd believed it was a family matter. Cole cross-examined him with the specific strategy of a man trying to create doubt without directly contradicting. How far away were you? How certain are you of what you saw versus what you inferred? In the noise and disruption of a wagon train breaking camp, could you be absolutely certain of the sequence of events? Alderman said, "I'm certain that the girl was standing in the road when we drove away. I'm certain she was alone. I am certain her stepmother was on that wagon bench driving away from her." Cole let it go. Mrs. Brenner's letter was read into the record by Webb in a quiet, deliberate voice. The letter confirmed what Alderman had said and added detail. She had given Elsie biscuits. She had said she was sorry. She had known, she wrote, that what was happening was wrong, and she had done too little about it, and she would carry that for a long time. The courtroom was quiet when Webb finished reading. Then Webb called Ruth Alger. Ruth Alger was a woman in her late 40s with a face that had been weathered by more than weather. The kind of face that showed the specific damage of having had something taken from you and knowing exactly who took it and knowing there was very little you could do. She sat in the witness chair and she described what had happened to her family's property the previous year. The debt instrument, Harlan Greer, the forced sale, the price that bore no relationship to the land's actual value, the speed of it. She kept coming back to the speed of it, how fast it had all moved once it started. Cole objected. He said this was irrelevant to a custody matter. Webb said the relevance would become clear. The judge said, "Continue, but get there." Webb got there. He asked Ruth Alger whether she knew who had identified her property to Greer's attention. She said she'd since learned it was a man who'd worked on their spread the season before, a man named Coe. The name landed in the room. Webb said, "To your knowledge, is Coe currently employed by the respondent, Caleb Mercer?" Ruth said, "I was told he was, for a time, and that he left." Webb said, "Thank you. No further questions." Cole said, on cross, "You have no direct evidence of any relationship between my client and Harlan Greer." Ruth said, "No, I don't." Cole said, "Thank you." He sat down, and his expression was controlled, but Elsie watched his hands and saw them flatten on the table in the particular way of someone who has just heard something they didn't want the room to hear. Webb called one more witness before Elsie, a man named Garrett, who worked as a notary in Helena. He was a precise, uncomfortable man who clearly would have preferred to be somewhere else, and he answered Webb's questions in the short, careful sentences of someone who understood that whatever he said was going to be used for something he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to be part of. He confirmed that he had notarized documents for Harlan Greer on multiple occasions. He confirmed that he had also, in December of the previous year, notarized a document for a woman named Dorothy Vane in connection with a property-related inquiry. He said he could not speak to the content of that document as it was confidential, but he confirmed the date and the names. December. 1 month before Dorothy left Elsie on the road. Webb said, "No further questions." The judge looked at Cole. Cole said, "No questions." His client was looking at the table. Then Webb said, Your Honor, the respondent calls Elsie Carter. She had been sitting so still for so long that the act of standing felt strange, like her body had to remember how. She walked to the witness stand and sat in the chair that was too large for her and looked at Webb, who gave her one small nod. Elsie, he said, can you tell the court what happened on the morning of January 14th of this year? She told it. She told it the way she'd told it to Caleb that first night, to Isabella in the kitchen, to Webb at the table 3 times. She told it in the order it happened, and she used the words she remembered, and she did not look at Dorothy while she spoke. She looked at Webb, and then, when she was finished with the narrative part, at the judge. She described the blanket, the canvas sack, the dried meat, and the crackers and the matches. She described Dorothy's face when she said extra weight, the blankness of it, the absence that was worse than cruelty. She described Mrs. Brenner pressing biscuits into her hand and saying she was sorry. She described watching the wagon train move away. She said, she never looked back. I stood there until the wagon was gone and she never once turned around. The courtroom was very quiet. What did you do then? Webb said. I started walking east, she said. My father had taught me how to navigate by the sun. I walked for 2 days. In January. Yes? Alone. Yes. You were 9 years old. I was, she said. I still am. There was a sound in the room, not quite a laugh, not quite anything else, the involuntary response of people to an unexpected moment of plain truth. The judge's expression did not change, but his eyes were attentive in a way they'd been since she started speaking. Webb said, when you arrived at the Mercer Ranch, what happened? She described it. Caleb on the ridge, the ride, Isabella at the door. The first warm room she'd been in 2 days. She described the oatmeal. She described being told there was more in the pot, that she didn't have to ration. And in the months since January, Webb said, how would you describe your life at the Mercer Ranch? She thought about that honestly. Hard sometimes, she said. It's a working ranch. There's a lot to do, and winter was difficult, and there were problems I didn't fully understand until they got more complicated. She paused. But I have a room. I have work that matters. I've learned things. I know where things are. I know the horses by name, and I know which ones have bad habits and which ones are reliable, and I know how to read the weather coming off the North Ridge before it arrives. She paused again. I know the people. I trust the people. Do you feel safe there? Yes. Do you want to return to the care of Dorothy Vane? She looked at Webb. Then, for the first time since she'd sat down, she looked at Dorothy. Dorothy was looking back at her. The same inventory expression, the same flat assessment. There was nothing in her face that looked like wanting. There was only the recognition of something being assessed. Elsie looked back at the judge. No, she said, I don't. Not because I hate her. I don't. But she made her position clear in January. I was weight she couldn't carry. That hasn't changed. What's changed is that I'm now connected to something she wants. She said it without heat, without performance, just plainly. I don't want to go back to being weight. The room was quiet. Webb said, Thank you, Elsie. No further questions. Listen. Cole stood up. He was careful with her. She'd expected that. She was 9, and anything that looked like badgering a child was going to hurt his client more than help her, and he knew it. He asked her questions designed to plant small doubts rather than directly contradict. Had she perhaps misunderstood what Dorothy meant that morning? Children sometimes did. Had she considered that Dorothy may have believed she was making the best possible decision for the child's welfare, given her limited options? Elsie said, She told me she couldn't afford extra weight. I'm not sure how I misunderstood that. He moved on. He asked whether it was possible that Dorothy had been searching for her and simply taken time to locate her. Elsie said, She arrived at the ranch the week after Caleb came back from Helena, where he'd been looking into Harlan Greer's debt claim. If she'd been searching for 5 months, she'd have been faster. Cole looked at her for a moment, the look of a man recalibrating. He said, You're quite confident in your conclusions. She said, I try to distinguish between what I know and what I think. What I know is what happened in January. What I think is that the timing of her arrival was not a coincidence, but I understand those are 2 different things. Another small sound in the room, Cole said, after a pause. No further questions. He sat down. The judge made a note. He looked at both tables. He said, I'm going to take a recess before closing arguments. We'll resume in 1 hour. What? They sat in the corridor outside on a wooden bench, the three of them, Caleb, Isabella, Elsie, with Webb standing nearby reviewing his notes. The corridor had the same institutional smell as the courtroom and the same flat light, and Elsie sat between Caleb and Isabella and felt the warmth of them on either side of her, which was not nothing. You did well, Isabella said, quietly. I just told the truth, Elsie said. That's what doing well looks like in a place like that. Caleb hadn't said anything yet. He was looking at the far wall, his jaw set, his hands loose on his knees. She could feel that he was holding something, not anger exactly, but something adjacent to it. He'd been holding it since Cole had asked his careful, insinuating questions, each one designed to make a 9-year-old child's clear account sound like a misinterpretation. Caleb, she said. He looked at her. It's all right, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. You told them I was the first person who picked you, he said. It was not a question. He'd heard her say it in the courtroom in answer to one of Webb's questions about what the ranch meant to her. After my father, she said. Yes. He looked back at the far wall. After a moment, roughly, he said, Your father would have thought you did fine today. She held that for a while. I think so too, she said. Nuts. Closing arguments were what they were. Cole's careful and sympathetic and built on the legal architecture of Dorothy's claim, Webb's direct and evidence-grounded and pointed at the pattern rather than any single piece of it. Webb ended by saying that the court's function in a matter of this kind was the welfare of the child, and that the evidence of the child's welfare at the Mercer Ranch was clear, while the evidence of the petitioner's motivations was, at minimum, troubling enough to warrant serious consideration. The judge took less time than Elsie had expected. He came back from his chambers after 40 minutes, sat, looked at his notes, and spoke in the even, unaffected tone of a man who had made his decision and was stating it, not performing it. He said that the testimony of multiple witnesses established, to his satisfaction, that the child had been deliberately abandoned rather than accidentally separated from her guardian. He said that the petition for custody restoration therefore faced a significant evidentiary burden, which the petitioner had not met. He said further that the connection between the petitioner and Harlan Greer, while not proven to his courtroom standard as a formal conspiracy, was sufficiently documented to call the petitioner's motivations into serious question. He said that the child's testimony had been coherent, specific, and uncontradicted in its essential facts. He said that the child's welfare was clearly served by remaining in her current placement. He denied the petition. He further noted that the debt claim filed by Harlan Greer against the Mercer property would be referred to the territorial court for full examination, and that given the documented pattern of similar claims associated with Greer's name, he was recommending the examination include a review of Greer's other recent filings. He closed his notebook. He said, "This proceeding is concluded." He left. The room took a breath. Elsie sat at the table and looked at the surface of it, and felt something move through her that was not triumph, not relief, not happiness exactly. Something more complicated than any of those things. Something that had weight and texture and history in it. She had been sitting in a courtroom today because a woman had driven away from her in January without looking back. The thing that had just happened, the judge's words, the denial, did not undo January. It didn't give her father back, didn't erase the 2 days she'd spent walking across frozen land with a canvas sack and a wooden horse, didn't remove the fact that she had been, for a time, exactly what Dorothy had called her, something no one wanted. But it meant that was over. It meant someone had looked at all of it and decided she counted. She took the wooden horse out of her coat pocket and held it in both hands. Webb was packing his briefcase. Behind her, she could hear Caleb standing, the bench shifting. Isabella's hand came onto her shoulder, brief and warm, and then gone. Cole and Dorothy were leaving through the side door. Dorothy did not look at Elsie on her way out. She did not look at anyone. She walked out with the particular stillness of a woman who had recalibrated and was already, somewhere in that organized mind, moving on to the next arrangement. Elsie watched her go. She felt nothing about it, and then she felt a small, unexpected thing, something close to pity. Not the soft kind, not the kind that excused anything. The specific, unsentimental pity you felt for a person who had arranged their life so efficiently around self-interest that they had arrived here, today, in this room, with no one on their side of the bench. She put the wooden horse back in her pocket. Caleb came around to the front of the table. He looked down at her. "Ready to go home?" he said. Home. She had heard the word before, obviously. She had used it herself, in ordinary ways and ordinary sentences. But it landed differently today, landed with the weight of something that had been fought for, and was now, specifically and legally and irrevocably, hers. She stood up. "Yes," she said. "Bet." They rode back to the ranch the next morning, and the drive took most of the day, and somewhere in the last hour the clouds broke, and the May sun came through in the particular extravagant way it came through after a long gray spell. Not subtle, not apologetic, just suddenly and fully there. Hutch was waiting in the yard when they arrived. He had clearly been waiting for a while because he was leaning on the paddock fence in the patient way of a man who has been leaning on fences his whole life and has gotten good at it. He looked at the three of them getting down from the wagon. "Well?" he said. "She stays," Caleb said. Hutch nodded. Once, slowly, the way he did everything. He looked at Elsie. "Good," he said. He pushed off the fence and went back to his work. Miguel had heard them come in and appeared in the barn doorway and looked at Elsie with his perpetually startled expression, and then, apparently deciding that this moment called for more than his usual silence, said, "You're staying?" "I'm staying," she said. He nodded several times, processing this information. "Good," he said. Then he went back into the barn, and she could hear him telling Roy and Dennis in rapid, slightly agitated Spanish, and Roy came to the barn door and looked at her with the expression of a man who had been wrong about something and was working through how he felt about that. "Good," Roy said, grudgingly. It was the most Roy had ever directly said to her. She decided to let it be enough. That evening, after supper, Caleb told her that Webb had sent word about Harlan Greer. The territorial court review had already turned up 2 additional properties where Greer had filed claims using the same pattern, the same debt instruments, the same notary, the same compressed timeline between filing and forced sale. The court had suspended Greer's ability to file new claims pending a full investigation. His existing claims, including the one against the Mercer property, were frozen. It did not mean the debt claim was gone. It meant it was being looked at by people whose job it was to look at things like this, which was a different situation from before. "Will you lose the ranch?" Elsie said. "No," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "My father paid that debt. I know he did. The documentation is gone, but documentation is not the only kind of evidence. There are people who knew my father, who knew the original creditor, who can speak to the transaction. It'll take time and it'll cost money, and it will be irritating from start to finish. But no, I won't lose the ranch." She nodded. "Greer overreached," he said. "Men like that usually do eventually. They get comfortable with how well it's worked before, and they stop being as careful." He looked at her. "You're part of why this one broke open when it did. You're noticing Co, telling me before he'd finished whatever he was doing here." She shook her head slightly. "Hutch told me about the Alger spread." "Hutch told you a fact," Caleb said. "You assembled it into something useful. Those aren't the same thing." She looked at the table. "Your father raised a careful person," he said. She looked up. He was looking at her with that expression, the open, unguarded one, the one she'd learned to recognize as the face he wore when he'd stopped managing himself and was just present. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" "About what I want to ask you." He folded his hands on the table. "I'm not good at this kind of thing. I want to say that first because the way I say it is probably going to be worse than what I mean." She waited. "I want to make this permanent," he said. "Formal, not just an arrangement. There are legal processes, Webb tells me, for a man to formally adopt a child, to make her his legally and on record, so that no one can come into a courtroom again and call it an unauthorized placement. He paused. I want to do that, if you want me to. The kitchen was very quiet. I'm not saying it would be easy, he said. I'm not easy to live with, I know that. I work too much and I don't always say things when I should, and I'm better with horses than with people most of the time. He looked at his hands. But I would try. I'm already trying, if you haven't noticed. She had noticed. She had been noticing for 4 months. She thought about what he had given her without naming it as a gift. The rope for Pearl, the Saturday morning in the paddock, the walk through the barn in the lamplight, the night before the hearing when he'd sat in her room and told her she deserved to know where she stood. She thought about the word he had used tonight, permanent. She thought about what permanent meant when you were 9 years old and the only permanent thing you'd ever had was a wooden horse and a dead father's voice in your head. She thought about what her father would have said about Caleb Mercer. He would have said, "He's a man who shows you who he is in the first few minutes, if you pay attention." She had been paying attention for 4 months. "Yes," she said. He looked up. "Yes," she said again, because she wanted to be clear. "I want you to." He held her look for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once, the way he nodded at things that were settled. Isabella, at the stove, had her back to them. Her shoulders were doing something that she would probably claim, if asked, had nothing to do with what was happening at the table behind her. "All right," Caleb said. "All right," Elsie said. They sat at the table together for a while longer, not talking, which was comfortable in the way that quiet between people who trust each other is comfortable, not empty, just resting. The summer that followed was the best of Elsie's life up to that point, though she would not have said so at the time in those words, because she was 10 years old by July, and 10-year-olds rarely have the perspective to recognize good things while they're inside them. What she knew was that she rode Pearl every morning, and that Pearl had gotten sound and strong again and moved like herself, which was to say, like a horse who knew her own value. She knew that Isabella was teaching her to cook things she'd never cooked before, complicated things, things with multiple steps and timing that had to be right, and that she was getting good at it, which was its own particular satisfaction. She knew that Hutch had started bringing her along when he checked the north fence line, which was a 4-hour ride, and that they spent most of it in companionable silence and occasional practical conversation about the land, and that she was learning things about the ranch and the territory that she wouldn't have learned any other way. She knew that in the evenings, more often than not, Caleb sat at the kitchen table after supper, and she sat across from him, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they didn't, and both were fine. She knew that Miguel had stopped being startled by her presence, which she considered a significant development. She knew that Roy Falk, who had never quite apologized for the orphanage comment, had taken to leaving the best cuts of wood near the kitchen door on cold mornings, which she suspected was as close to an apology as Roy got. She knew that the wooden horse lived on the windowsill of her room, not in her coat pocket, not clutched in her hands through the night, and that this was different. That keeping it on the windowsill meant she was somewhere, meant she had a windowsill to put it on, and a room to be somewhere in, and a place she came back to at the end of the day. The formal adoption papers came through in September, processed by Webb, with his usual combination of efficiency and detailed invoicing. Caleb rode to the county seat to sign them and came back in the late afternoon with the document folded in his coat pocket. He gave it to Elsie at the supper table. She read it. It was dense with legal language, and her name appeared in several places, each time as Elsie Mercer, formerly Elsie Carter. Elsie Mercer. She looked at the words. "You don't have to use it," Caleb said. "The name. If you want to keep Carter. It was your father's." She thought about that for a moment. "Can I have both?" He looked at her. "Carter is who I was," she said. "Who my father made me. I don't want to just set that aside." She looked at the document. "But Mercer is who I am now too, where I belong." She paused. "Is that allowed?" "I think people are allowed to be more than one thing," Caleb said. "Generally." She folded the paper and held it. Elsie Carter Mercer. She said it to herself quietly, trying the weight of it. It felt true in the way that names felt true when they matched something real, not assigned, not given, but earned. She had come across the frozen land in January with nothing but a canvas sack and a wooden horse, and she had kept moving because her father's voice was in her head saying, "Keep going anyway." And she had found a ridge rider who had looked at a small figure in the wilderness and made a choice. She thought about that choice now from the other side of it. She understood, in a way she was only beginning to understand, what that choice had cost Caleb. Not the practical cost, the time, the money, Webb's fees, the risk of whatever Greer's claim represented, but the other kind of cost. The cost of opening something that had been deliberately closed. He had built walls after his wife and son died, and the walls had worked, in the functional sense that walls work. They kept things out. What he hadn't considered, maybe, was what else they were keeping in. All that silence and all that empty space and all that time working alone on land that was valuable and meant nothing. She had walked through his gate in January, and he had not sent her away, and she thought she understood now that it had been as much a rescue for him as it had been for her, though he would never have used that word about himself, because Caleb Mercer did not use words like that about himself. She would use it for him someday. Not tonight. Done. The Greer case resolved the following spring. It took longer than Webb had predicted and cost more money than Caleb had wanted to spend, but the territorial court found, through the testimony of 3 men who had known Thomas Mercer in his last years, that the debt had been settled. The debt instrument was declared invalid. Greer's claim was dismissed. Harlan Greer himself faced a separate proceeding regarding the Alger property and 2 others where the same pattern had been used. That proceeding moved slowly, the way such things did, but it moved. Ruth Alger came to the Mercer ranch once that summer. She'd been passing through the territory, and had supper with them, and Elsie sat across from her and thought about the kind of damage that was done not by violence but by paperwork, by the quiet manipulation of systems that most people trusted because they had to, and about the specific courage it took to sit in a courtroom and say, "This happened to me, and it was wrong." She understood that courage better than she had before. Dorothy Vane she did not hear from again. There was no dramatic ending to that chapter. No confrontation, no reckoning, no moment where Dorothy looked at what she'd done and was changed by it. That was not how Dorothy Vane worked. She recalculated and redirected, and wherever she went after the hearing, she went there as herself, efficient, practical, and entirely untroubled by the version of January that existed in her own account. Elsie thought about her occasionally, and the thought she always arrived at was the one she'd had in the courthouse corridor, the specific pity of a person who has built a life so clean of feeling that there is nothing left in it that can't be abandoned when the arithmetic changes. She did not hate Dorothy Vane. She had decided sometime in that first winter that hatred was too expensive for her budget. It cost too much of your attention and gave back too little. What she had instead was clarity, a clear-eyed understanding of what Dorothy was and what she wasn't, and why the distinction mattered. Dorothy was not a monster. She was something more ordinary than that, and therefore more important to understand. A person who had never learned that other people were real in the same way she was real. Who had moved through the world treating people as variables in her own equation, to be solved for or discarded as the math required. Elsie intended to be different, not perfectly different. She had a practical streak herself, and she was not sentimental in the way some people were, and she had an ability to see situations clearly that could look from the outside like coldness. She knew this about herself. She had learned it from watching the people around her, from Caleb, who was direct without being cruel, from Isabella, who was efficient without being indifferent, from Hutch, who said very little and meant all of it. She was learning what it meant to be sharp-eyed and still warm at the same time. She was learning that these were not opposites. Oh, the winter she turned 11, a snowstorm came in hard off the North Ridge and kept them all indoors for 3 days. The horses were settled in the barn with extra hay, and Pearl was in her stall, still and steady, the rope hanging untouched because she'd apparently outgrown her need for it somewhere in the past year, which Elsie felt was a sign of something, though she couldn't have said exactly what. On the second evening, they were all in the kitchen, Caleb at the table with a ledger, Isabella mending something at the counter, Elsie reading by the lamp, and the wind outside was doing that thing it did in deep winter, pressing against the walls as if it was looking for a way in, and couldn't find one. Elsie looked up from her book. She looked at Caleb's bent head over the ledger, the lamplight on the side of his face, the way his hand moved across the page, and the careful, deliberate way he did all things. She looked at Isabella at the counter, her quick, efficient hands, the slight angle of her head that meant she was half listening to everything in the room, even while she worked. She looked at the wooden horse on the windowsill. She thought, this is it. This is what he meant. Her father had carved that horse and given it to her and told her it would bring her luck. And she had clutched it through 2 days of frozen wilderness and 4 months of uncertainty and a courtroom and everything that came after. She had carried it like a talisman, like a thread connecting her to the person who had made her who she was. And it had brought her here. Not perfectly. Not without cost. Not without the specific ache that would always live in the space where her father's voice used to be. But here, to this kitchen, this lamplight, these people, this life that had been built not by accident, but by a series of choices made by imperfect people who decided, each in their own way and in their own time, that she was worth choosing. That was the thing nobody told you about belonging. It was not given. It was not inherited. It was not the automatic consequence of blood or paper or proximity. It was a practice. It was something you did daily in the small decisions. The rope in Pearl's stall, the biscuits pressed into a cold hand, the man who turned his horse and rode down from the ridge. It was built, carefully, by people who decided it was worth building. She had been part of building this one too. She understood that now. She had stayed. She had been useful. She had paid attention and noticed things and said difficult things at difficult moments and shown up in the barn at first light and told the truth in a courtroom when telling it was hard. She had not waited to be wanted before she acted like someone worth wanting. Her father had taught her that. She just hadn't known yet when he was alive that he was teaching it. She went back to her book. Outside, the winter wind pressed and pressed against the walls of the house. The walls held.